The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Hey, baby.
Hey, baby.
You know, I think I'll save it for while we're chatting to tonight's guest, but I'll be honest, I'm obsessed with stories from you at the moment about where you work and the energy sucking spiritual forces there. So
Yeah, I know. We're all doing some research on it, so hopefully I'll have something for you soon.
that's fantastic. How was your day there today, other than having your energy sucked?
It was very good. Very good.
That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Well, I'm not a sense. Sorry?
I said, how was your day?
You know, we won't go into those details. Okay. I don't want to bore the audience. Are probably far more interested in hearing about the haunted, spiritual draining location that you work in. Not spiritual draining, that's wrong. Energy draining. See, I'm not an empath or a sensitive. I could probably go into your place of work and wouldn't feel anything.
Well, you never know. You might.
You do never know, I guess. Anyway, we do have to ask tonight's guest a little bit about that, because I'm sure he'll have had similar experience or know of similar experiences. So anyway, for nearly 3 decades, tonight's guest has traveled the back roads of the world in search of the strange and unusual, from tracking vampires in Transylvania and searching for the elusive monster of Loch Ness, to trailing the dangerous Tata Duende through the remote villages of Belize and searching for ghosts in Ireland's haunted castles. He has scoured the earth in search of the paranormal. He has been featured on the Discovery Channel's A Haunting, William Shatner's Weird or What, geez, I love Shatner, ABC's Scariest Places on Earth, Monsters and Mysteries in America, along with being a frequent contributor to Ripley's Believe It or Not radio. With a master's degree in psychology, he has authored over 20 books on the supernatural and extensively lectures on his fascinating findings. The more bizarre the legend, the more likely it is that you will find him here. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome tonight's guest, Chad Lewis.
Sorry. That would be me.
That's all right. Chad, how are you?
Hey, greetings from the back roads of Wisconsin.
Hey.
Fantastic. You know, that's where I am too. We're both from Wisconsin tonight. Jen's from Missouri, but we've got 2 Wisconsinites here.
And I have the Wisconsin accent, which you do not.
Yes, that's true. I failed that one. You beat me on that, Chad. We were chatting a little bit about you coming from Eau Claire before, which is where I run Midwest Weird Fest. So it's very, very close to my heart. I remember, and I hadn't even planned to ask you this, but I can't remember whose book it was in. It wasn't one of yours, and you've written so many fantastic books. It was, I don't know if it was in a Linda Godfrey book or a Lon Strickler book. I remember reading about some Mothman sighting or something near there, or somebody seeing something, you know, unusual in the air. Did you hear about that story in Eau Claire?
Not that one particular one, but there's so many Eau Claire, Chippewa Valley stories but yeah, I'm probably Linda, maybe in a weird Wisconsin book she did with Richard Hendricks, or one of her many other fabulous books. But I haven't heard of any flying creatures, but wouldn't surprise me.
They are everywhere. And speaking of fantastic books, your new Supernatural Dares of the Midwest is an absolute blast. I can only imagine how much, well, for me, it might have been a little scary, but how much fun it must have been to put together that book and go out and do these dares.
Oh, it was scary for me as well. That I always state when people ask, do you ever get scared at these places? And my reply has always been, if you're not getting scared, you're probably not trying hard enough. That these places are just downright creepy. Even if you don't believe in the folklore or the legends, if you're out there by yourself, let's say midnight, an abandoned area, no help anywhere around, it's impossible for your mind not to start conjuring up images of werewolves or sirens or other beings.
Is there one dare that, or maybe a couple, are there ones which really bothered you when you were doing them, when you thought, maybe I shouldn't do this one?
Well, in terms of me being hurt or cursed with ill fortune or misfortune, or even death, I wasn't so worried about that. But there was a dare that sticks out as one of the most gruesome and gory ones that I don't like going there quite often. And it's called the Death Curve, and it's in Illinois. And the reason is that it's a sharp left turn in a road. And people say that when you drive down the road, the dare is when you're driving, you'll see this woman with a bloody axe, the spirit of her, and she'll come out and run you off the road and you'll crash and die. Hence the name Death Curve. And the place isn't scary in its own right. It's out in the country, it's rural, but outside of that, it looks like any old lonesome road that you'd travel down on a Sunday drive. But the story detailing this mother who went insane and ended up taking the lives of her 7 children by axe before burning the place down and committing suicide. That type of story, when you have that kind of just sinister nature behind it, it's very hard to be in a place like that, even if you have zero psychic ability or feeling any of this energy like I don't whatsoever. It's hard not to be affected by just knowing the gruesome history.
Yeah, I noticed that there were a number of dare backstories which were also hard for you to decipher in that book. Like there would be so many different legends, and you'd have to try to work out, did somebody commit suicide, or was somebody killed, or who killed who? And that seemed to be an ongoing thread through a lot of those stories. So that must be something which is difficult for you as a researcher when you're approaching some of these, to try to get to the bottom of it as well, I would think.
Some stories, like the one I just told you, we have the evidence of the old newspaper accounts, death certificates. But for a lot of it, the folklore is very fuzzy, that sometimes it doesn't even tell you a decade in which the legend was supposed to have originated in. So you can't find if there's a legend that a busload of children died on a railroad track by being hit by a train. And now if you park your car on that track, they'll push it over. Their spirits will push it to safety. But there's usually never a year or a date given. So finding truth from fiction is sometimes very, very difficult.
Yeah, there's one not far from me. There's a bridge in Stevens Point. Did you want to tell us a little bit about that one? Because that's pretty close to where I'm at.
Yes, well, the most famous Stevens Point bridge, or infamous, if you will, is Bloody Bride Bridge. It's on Highway 66. And the legend is that many years ago, a woman was coming home from her wedding night, and she was involved in a car accident on that bridge. Unfortunately, she bled to death waiting for help to arrive. And since that time, whenever it was, unsuspecting motorists driving over the bridge would see a woman in a bloody bridal gown standing on the side of the road. And like everybody who would see that, you'd think maybe this person broke down or needs some assistance. So they'd slow down only to have her vanish right before their eyes.
That story is very much like something you would have seen in that show Supernatural. Remember that TV series where the brothers were out, hunting demons and things. It's very much that folkloric tale that you can imagine being converted into a Hollywood TV episode or film or something.
I think that might even be their first episode they ever did, was the woman in white vanishing hitchhiker.
Oh, really?
This fits in perfectly to that. An officer was said to have been the first person to see it. He was driving at night, and this woman in a bloody gown appeared in front of him. So he slammed on his brakes. He braced for impact. And when he came to a screeching halt, he got out, looked for the dead body or the roadkill, if you will, and nobody was there. But he scoured the area looking, convinced he had run over somebody. And then he left, perplexed that I thought there was someone there. And that's a key hallmark of a lot of these witnesses, is they are absolutely convinced they weren't hallucinating or they weren't tired, that something was actually there.
As a psychologist and a folklorist, which you're obviously both after having looked at so many of these things, what do you think is the reason that there's so many bridge dares and so many bridge supernatural stories? Like, it really that's another thing that really popped out of me in that book. So many involve bridges.
Yes. And that was an overriding theme. And I talk about some of these themes in DARES, of how most of them you have to do things 3 times, or the date is very important, or the time, midnight, pops up quite a bit throughout the DARES. And then another segment would be bridges. And of course, those who study folklore often see the significance not only of bridges connecting water to earth, but also the spirit world with the natural world. And it just seems that water has played a huge part in folklore from the very beginning, that oftentimes many creatures, including ghosts or vampires, are said not to be able to cross through running water. So oftentimes early people would bury their loved ones on the other side of running water in the cemetery, with the belief that that person couldn't come back and follow them back to the village, that they'd be trapped there. And of course, we have all the old stories of sea serpents and sirens associated with water. So it makes sense that bridges would still have that folklore tied to it, even in today's modern world, where most people are not afraid of bridges like they were in the past, where they would often crumble and fall. You could easily go off the side. They weren't constructed very well. So in the old days, there was a fear for bridges, but today they're relatively safe, but yet we still fear them. And you're right. You could do an entire book of haunted bridges, which people have.
You're talking about water as well. There's a number of water ones, and there's one I want to get to a little bit later when we cross over into Wendigo lore. But I've seen you do a video actually where you there's one where a girl who supposedly drowned or something will pull you into the lake, which is kind of shallow and then gets a little deeper. And if you walk, I think in the video you actually walk across the lake when you do the dare. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that dare? I found that one quite fascinating as well.
Yes, it's actually on a river, and it's the waterway where this woman named Mary Dean was said to have drowned when she was coming up on a steamboat many years ago. And she was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on this island named after her, named Mary Dean. And for years, people lived out on the island. They had a post office and businesses, and now it's abandoned, but maybe not empty, because many claim she haunts both the island and the river. And the dare has always been that if you're brave enough or foolish enough to walk into the water, she will pull you under and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity in the river with Mary Dean. Pardon me. So the interesting part of that, though, is witnesses who claim to have seen her claim that she acts like a siren, saying things like, "Help me, I can't swim, I'm drowning, please save me, don't leave me." And that entices people in. And I think the tragic part of the story is that every year, several people drown in that very spot. And I've talked to several of their family members and loved ones who told me that person was just drawn there for some unknown reason. They had no business. They weren't there fishing or swimming day after day. They just went there, were driven there by some unseen force that forced them to go out into the water, and it ended up taking their lives.
Yeah, there's definitely something about a strange attraction to water that can do people in. I'll just tell I think maybe I've told it on the show once before, but hopefully everybody hasn't heard it. This is a fascinating story. You might enjoy, Chad. When I was raised, I was always told this story of a family member a few generations before mine had been disappearing from her bed at night, and they'd always find these watery footprints in the house, and she'd wake up with mud on her feet. It sounds like something from a horror movie, like totally fake story, right? And then one night the other family members waited up and followed to see what happened. And she went out and actually went swimming in a dam, like sleepwalking and sleep swimming. And they yelled to her when she was in the dam, and she woke up and drowned. Now, as I got older, I always thought that just has to be a fanciful myth. It can't be true. When I moved to America, just before I moved here, my mother actually found the old news clipping and pulled it out and showed it to me. And true enough, so that's only vaguely related, but whenever I hear stories about being people attracted to water or the strange fate of water, I always think of that story of my relative from multiple generations ago wandering out into the dam and being woken in the middle of the night, and just imagine waking up and then drowning. Just a horrifying tale.
That's an amazing story. And years ago, they would have claimed that she had been fairy led out to the water and possibly drowned. And who knows if she was or not. But I love those type of stories, especially, you're right, that water seems to hold this almost paranormal beacon that attracts people to it. And whether it's good or bad, I mean, just how many people love living on the water or going to the water, that they go to Lake Superior or other Great Lakes and they feel like they're at home, like they should be there. There's something about the water that's nourishing and life-giving. So it makes sense that there might be an opposite to that as well.
Yeah, it's definitely strange. Funnily, another funny personal story. I was at the local lake just the other day with my daughter. We hadn't been there yet this season, and driftwood had changed since we were there last season. And there was something that, I mean, it full on looked like a Nessie or a sea serpent, and her obviously being exposed to Loch Ness type documentaries, which she loves. She was like, "What's that? Is that Nessie?" I'm like, "It looks like Nessie, doesn't it?" It was a funny moment. Something else I found really interesting in your book were two different dares which had nothing to do with each other, but they were almost polar opposites. And maybe you can talk a little bit about both of them. One was that if you drove under multiple underpasses, I think it was 7, you would open the gateway to hell. And then there was another story that if you followed some other trail or drove down a hill or something, you would open the gateway to heaven. And I found it fascinating that there were these two conflicting, similar ideas, but one took you to paradise and one took you to the fiery pit.
And certainly the anomaly is the portal to hell or the portal to heaven that would open up in a place called Viger's Cemetery. If you roll down the hill 3 times, the portal to the other world opens up and welcomes you in, is the legend. And that's really an outlier, because most of these legends, 90+% of them, it's always bad luck, misfortune, or death that will follow you when you do them. It's hardly ever anything good where if you do the dare, you'll win the lottery or find true love. It's always negative things. So that was one of the dares that had a positive attachment to it, that if you rolled down this hill, a portal to heaven would allow you into the pearly gates. And unfortunately, when I rolled down, I must have been rolling the wrong way, because that's the only reason I could think of that I wouldn't be allowed into the gates. But it didn't work for me. But yes, you have these polar opposites where there are many gates to hell. The one I threw in the book was in Collinsville, Illinois, where if you go through these 7 tunnels, portal to hell will open up and swallow you in. But at the same time, there are at least some warning signs. Once you start passing through a couple of these tunnels, weird things will start to happen, including hellhounds starting to appear and warning you. So I guess if you follow through to all 7, you've been warned.
There is something fascinating for the legend tripper, as you mentioned before. And I think Zelia Edgar, who wrote the foreword for your book and is such an amazing upcoming, I think, talent, as I'm sure you agree, points out in there is a supernatural dare offers something which a lot of other either Bigfoot hunting or ghost hunting or UFO spotting doesn't really offer. It gives you a clear set of instructions that lets you perhaps manifest the paranormal.
I really wanted, and Zelia did a great job with the forward, and she's been on a couple dares with me and survived, knock on wood. I really, in a perfect world, would have loved to have done an entire book on the belief systems and rites of passage and looking at these things from a psychological viewpoint, but that's just not the demographic I'm going for. So in the book, I touch on it a bit, like why we like to get scared and how these things are seen as tests of bravery and rites of passage, that it's more, I think, more bizarre than just the dare. There's a lot of layers to it. It's more intricate than just going out, knocking on a gravestone 3 times, hoping a witch appears. That when you start peeling this apart, you see there are many components to this that make a lot of sense as to why we do them. But I think what makes DARES so special is that there is that expectation that if you perform a ritual or an act or a deed, that something's going to happen in return, a bargain.
Yeah, there is also, though, you're right. And I like that about the book, how you talked about the fear aspects as well, and how somehow it's a rite of passage, and you overcome this and you become somehow stronger, or you get the appreciation of your peer group. Because I remember when I was a kid, I can't remember a specific supernatural dare, but I remember there was a house in my suburb, which was this old, really rundown kind of house. I'm sure it was a very old person who lived there. But one of the dare used to be to go and knock on that door when we were out, prowling around the suburbs in twilight or when it was getting dark, and then run, and who knows? I'm sure it was some poor old lady or something. But it was something that we dared each other to do. And there wasn't an attached story to it, like if you knock it, the witch will grab you or anything. But it was very much that rite of passage and that adrenaline buzz that you got when you're a 10-year-old boy knocking on the door and then, fleeing down the street. So,
and one of my areas of my interest areas is that looking at how these folklore and legends progress and morph over decade after decade, because I've talked to many people about a legend, many people that are seniors, and they'll tell me a version of the legend. And then you start talking to high school or college age kids, and they have a completely different version of the same legend that is changed over the last 50 years, which you would anticipate it would. But it's much like the telephone game that we used to play in grade school, where just every decade, a new generation puts their own spin on the legend and it changes a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I think in the book, one of the ones which seemed the most potentially dangerous, and this is a nice segue into your Wendigo book as well, is when you went out in winter into Wendigo Lake. And that's fascinating because it's a lake within an island within another lake. So can you tell us a little bit about Wendigo Lake and your experiences out there?
Sure. Windigo Lake sits in Minnesota, just a few miles east of Bemidji, up in the Northwoods. And as you said, it's a lake on an island in a bigger lake, which makes it an anomaly in itself. It was featured in Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon as the lake within a lake. And they have a long history of it being a sacred area, but also that it's a cursed area, that it's bad medicine out there, that there are many legends of people going out there and experiencing odd things. One of my favorite stories, and maybe a bit gruesome, is a group of individuals went out there years ago and set up camp, and the women started cooking at base camp. The men went into the woods to hunt for game. And when the men didn't come back that evening, the women got frightened and went to search for them and found them all hanging in trees, skinned, dead. And they left the island and vowed never to return. It was bad medicine. You don't want to be there. And when people went out with reinforcements to find these bodies, they were never found. And the stories of it being haunted go on and on and on. But the main legend is of a Windigo that is said to live in the lake. And many kids and children over the years drowned in that lake. So parents would tell them, don't go swimming in Lake Windigo because the Windigo will snatch you and pull you under and you'll die based on the Windigo. So there's that belief that the Windigo is actually using the lake like a kettle, like a giant kettle of its own purposes. So I think the only way for me to explore these legends is to go there for myself. So I decided to go on a winter camping expedition with some colleagues to get up and close with the Windigo.
And the weather was brutal when you were out there. I mean, that alone could have almost killed you. Forget the dare.
It almost did. So you're on this abandoned island. In the summer, there are a few summer homes there, and it's popular for fishermen and women and the like. But in the winter, completely dead. So even when we stopped at the visitor center and asked what would be the best way to get out there hiking with all of our gear on sled, they kind of laughed at us thinking, you're so foolish, you're going to die out there. Don't go camping. And it really ended up being about 30 degrees below zero with the wind chill. And I remember one of the nights I thought I was going to die. We were covered in snow gear, head to toe. And during the day, you're monkeying around, and no matter how hard you try, snow kind of gets on the inside of your boots and the pants, even though you have snow gear on. So sitting around a fire, you get warm at night, relax, all that snow and ice melts from the inside of your gear. So when I was leaving the fire, coming back to the tent, my pants were wet at the bottom. And so I had two choices. You can go to bed in your sleeping bag in the tent with wet clothing, and it'll freeze and you'll be wearing like boards on the bottom of your legs. But the other thing is to strip down to your underwear and put new clothes on that are cold, but at least dry. So that's what I decided to do. And I remember getting down to my underwear and thinking, I need to hurry and get into that bag, because if I don't get into that bag in just a few seconds, I might not ever get into that bag. I might have to run to the fire and just kind of sleep by the fire with my bag around me, because I looked into the tent and there's ice everywhere on the inside, the frost. And, I should have just put on some clothes over the outside and tucked in the bed and dealt with it. But I made a foolish mistake of stripping down in that element, thinking there's no help here. It was at least in the dark, probably a 4-hour hike across the ice to get to the nearest town. And, and at midnight, 1 a.m., what are you going to do? You'd probably die on the way there. So I was cursing myself for making the rookie mistake of not changing earlier.
Yeah.
I don't often address people commenting because we're an audio podcast. It goes out later as well. But somebody asked if you do these dares, and I think the whole point of the book is you do every dare in the book except for the one at the end, which is about this book that's probably a total myth, so nobody can find the book anyway. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in doing these dares for myself. That I know a lot of people don't want to tempt fate. They don't want to try it. They say, it's probably not true, but why take the chance? But for me, some of the excitement, the adventure of it is actually doing it. And there was one dare I threw in the book as a super bonus dare that it was the only dare I did not complete because people say it's impossible to complete. And it talks about this Book of the Dead that is said to be on display under lock and key in the basement of the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. And in some versions, it's the Whitewater Public Library. But it is said that when people check this book out, it causes them to go insane and they either commit suicide or die an untimely, gruesome, accidental death. And my point is, I don't know who keeps returning the book, but it keeps getting checked out. And now they have it under lock and key and refuse to let anybody check it out. So you can't actually do the dare because some say the book doesn't exist. And every year the librarians contact me and tell me that they don't have the book. Stop telling people this legend because we don't have the book, which is exactly what you would expect those sneaky librarians to tell you that are keeping this book under lock and key. But there are many stories in the local newspaper of the college, the Royal Purple or Purple Royal, whatever one it is, but talking about professors going insane and that if you even try to check the book out, you'll get expelled from the university. So it's probably the best known legend in Whitewater, which is known as Second Salem because they have so many legends. And this stands out as the most bizarre.
It's like something out of an H.P. Lovecraft novel almost.
Yeah.
Necronomicon or something.
Did any one of those dares kind of stick out to you to where you thought possibly it could be real? I mean, did any one of those really catch your attention?
There were several dares, and most people ask, have you ever had any ill effects from taking these dares? And it's a very tricky question because I don't know. It could be coincidental or it could be caused by this. For instance, there's a infamous dare in Iowa, the Black Angel of Death in Iowa City at their cemetery. And it's perhaps the best known angel, maybe in the US. And the legend, there are probably 30, 40 different variations, but they all tell that if you go out to this angel at night and touch it or kiss or talk, you'll die. No matter what you do. If you're a virgin, you'll die. If you're not a virgin, you'll die. Just don't go there. And I went there to film one of the videos of the DARES, and I'd been there maybe a dozen times before. And I was with my colleague, Kevin Lee Nelson, and we were filming the video, taking photos. It was really late at night, and we ended up driving back to a nearby motel for just a couple hours before we had to head off to the next legend. And somewhere between like 2:33 a.m. and 6 a.m., in the parking lot, Kevin's car that we both were in was sideswiped in the parking lot in those few hours after we did the dare. Now, is that bad luck or a drunk coming into the motel late at night? Another case after doing a dare of this a bridge where a woman is thought to have murdered her children, and there's a werewolf sighting there and a haunted train. It's a place called Terror Bridge in Iowa. After leaving there with some colleagues, just down the road, I got my first speeding ticket in 20 years. So again, was that just a coincidence? I always liken it to if it was the dare cursing me, I feel like I got off pretty easy with just a speeding ticket or a crashed car rather than, death or dismemberment.
Yeah, they're like, we like you, Chad. We're not going to kill you. We're just going to give you a scratch on your car and a ticket. Back to Wendigo Lake, though, and to your other book, Wendigo Lore. It's funny. When this book came out about a year or so ago, that's when we first really wanted to get you onto the show, because I'm very interested in the Wendigo. And as I mentioned to you, before the show, when we were chatting just before we started recording, I didn't know how little I knew about the Wendigo. I mean, the book's fantastic. But what really, I think, stood out to me while I was reading that book is that there are so many vaguely mythical creatures, like Dogman would be a very good example. And there isn't really usually any serious ramification about a Dogman appearing. It's this mythology, and there's werewolves or dogmen or whatever. But Wendigo lore, particularly the way that it comes from Native American culture and how entrenched it was. There's stories in your book from the 19th and early 20th century where there were people, whether they were Wendigos or not, killing people and being killed. And so there's a real immediacy and something more sinister and more disturbing. And I know you talked about investigating one of those Wendigo cases, and you yourself were very moved by being there at ground zero where these murders had been happened. So maybe you can chat a little bit about the Swift Runner case and about the last Wendigo killer, because those stories were just absolutely fascinating.
And you're exactly right that the Windigo stories, unlike any other legend, superstition, cryptid, whatever it may be, as you said, you're probably not going to be killed by a vampire. There are not a lot of stories of that happening. But with the Windigo, we have hundreds of documented stories, probably thousands of undocumented stories where people were either killed or killed themselves because it was suspected that they were turning Windigo or going Windigo. And the Windigo itself is one of the oldest, if not oldest, North American legends that we have, but yet one of the least known. And I think we're probably just a generation or two too late collecting this research to get the real origin stories of people that remembered it, because it goes back so long that many people don't even know the origin. Many people who tell the story, and it's within their community that this giant Wendigo-like beast resides, they don't know where it came from because it's so old. So Kevin Nelson and myself in the book, he was the co-author, we write quite a bit that we felt like we were maybe 50 years too late to get the real old stuff that's been probably lost to history.
Yeah.
But the case of Swift Runner, if any of your listeners have ever heard of the Windigo, that's probably what they heard of. Swift Runner, who was a Cree Indian First Nation man up in Alberta area in Canada. And this was in the 1870s. And he was about 40 winters of age at that time. And during that time, winters were a little different than they are today, where game was scarce, food was nowhere to be found, and starvation was a huge threat. And oftentimes people would resort to cannibalism to make it through. And Swift Runner did the same exact thing, except he snapped, ended up killing and eating his entire family, and then claiming that it was the Windigo that possessed him, that he had snapped, went crazy, this evil overcame him and caused him to turn into a cannibal. And of course, the white law at that time did not see it that way. They saw it as murder. So they brought him to Fort Saskatchewan, put up a gallows, and took his life at the end of that rope for being a Windigo. And as you alluded to earlier, so I was there right before the pandemic hit with Kevin Nelson. We were at the spot, and we narrowed down to the general area of where Swift Runner's winter camp would have been, because in the summer at that time, a lot of the tribe would get together and live in a bigger community because food was more available. But in the winter, they would split into these family segments and spread out where they'd have a greater chance of survival. And in Swift Runner's camp, he actually led investigators back there. And that's when they found all of the bodies on the ground. He had bones and skin in his kettles. Some of the bones had been snapped and the marrow had been drained out of them that he was eating. So they knew he had done it. And being in that general area, you know, I've studied a lot of serial killers and mob hits and murders and suicides and untimely deaths, but I just wasn't quite prepared for the emotional wallop that was going to hit me, knowing that I was in the spot where this man, one by one, killed off his family and ate them, where the rest of the family had to participate, knowing that they were next. And it came down to him and one of his boys were the only two left. And just putting yourself in that kid's footsteps for a moment, knowing that he's next and there's nothing he can do. You know, he's 10 or 11 at the time. He can't just run off into the winter on his own. He would die. And he's trusting his father, but yet his father's the one who's going to betray him. So I just, there was something that even now, sometimes here back in Wisconsin, a year and a half, year and, you know, whatever it is later, there are still times I get a chill thinking back to standing there and just that experience of being in Swift Runner's presence.
Gosh, I bet.
Mm-hmm.
You're quite uniquely placed as a psychologist as well, probably, to look at Wendigo lore. And when you were studying it and examining it and digging up old stories and putting it together as a book, did you struggle with how much of this is perhaps a madness or a psychological disorder, and how much of it might be based on a genuine paranormal or spiritual experience?
I did an entire chapter in the book on Wendigo psychosis, and I could have done and would have loved to have done an entire book on it. But today, a lot of people look back at it and say it had to be a mental illness. It had to be some sort of psychosis they were going through, because it couldn't be true. But we really have no reason to doubt their story. Kevin and I kind of, we labeled it white-splaining, that Western cultures now look back and say, oh, these were just primitive people. They didn't know any better, superstitious. This couldn't have been true. It had to have been a mental illness. But when you read the original literature and hear some of the stories, you start to think that maybe they weren't suffering from mental illness, that maybe there was something there. And I think when you look back at the early literature, it's easy to see how blatantly racist the early newspaper reports were. And they often equated it to demon possession, believe it or not, that these people were possessed by mental illness and that forced them to act. But when you start reading these stories and digging into it, you know, I was of the firm belief that these people weren't making it up. They weren't identifying things. They weren't trying to hoax anybody, that they truly believed these things were happening. And that's the interesting question for me, is that what makes certain people believe this is true, that this is, I'll give you a quick example. the belief of the Windigo was so terrifying for people that there were many accounts that people would stay in their lodging and starve to death rather than go out and hunt for food or gather food, because there was a legend that the Windigo was merely in the area, wasn't there, wasn't coming after them, but was just in the vicinity. And that was so terrifying that they would rather starve to death, and they did, in their lodging than to go out and maybe encounter this Windigo.
Huh.
You know, and that kind of fear is just unheard of in today's world. And I think it's really hard for us to look back 300, 400 years and put ourselves in the mindset of what people of that era and that time period and that culture were thinking of this legend. But we know, because of so many of them dying, they were terrified of it.
You know, it's funny. It's something I have a slightly better grip of. Nothing like people who'd gone through that. But it's weird, me being somebody who was born and raised in Sydney, Australia, where you could sleep outside winter and you wouldn't have frozen to death or anything. But when I live now in central and north of Wisconsin, the brutality of the winters here is phenomenal. And I'm fine. Of course, I've got a diesel truck and I've got a wood furnace if my power goes out, and I've got a fully stocked pantry. And so I'm not going to be worrying about starving to death. But you start to see, when you live somewhere like this, how, whether it's a legend or it is a spiritual reality or it's something else, how it could be this dark force which descended in winter. And actually, I live not that far from the town of Black River Falls, and there's a fascinating documentary I'm sure you're aware of, and a book, Wisconsin Death Trip. And and Ed Gein's another example, all these people going loony, perhaps because of the winters, and who knows what's actually interfering with them at some spiritual level. But it's dark and it's weird and it's strange in this part of the world.
And that was one area I looked at, the seasonal affective disorder, SAD, thought to be the lack of sunlight, the lack of exercise, the cold weather. People would call it cabin fever in the Midwest, that you're just pent up in the, obviously with the pandemic, we can relate to that even more. But now imagine you don't have the lodging that we have today. You don't have the stockpiles of food. You don't have the comfort of top high-end gear and clothing. You're out living off of nature in those times. And it had to be very dark and troubling times, which is why the Windigo is always associated with the weather. Cold, brutal temperatures, blizzards, and the like. That's a key component of the Windigo, because that makes up the life of what people experienced 6 or 7 months, even more, 8 months out of the year up in the north of Canada.
I think I read somewhere once that perhaps there was some kind of crossover between a physical reality of the Wendigo and perhaps a Bigfoot type creature or something, that there might have been an external version of it other than just a spiritual kind of force. Is that something, I'll be honest, I didn't get through the entire book, so I'm not sure if it's something you touched on in the book or not, or is that something you're aware of? Or
yes, a lot of people comment that, is it possible the Windigo was just some Bigfoot or Sasquatch that went crazy, started killing and eating people? And although there are some accounts of the Windigo having thick brown fur, much like you would think of a Bigfoot or Sasquatch, much of the early literature is much, much different than what we would think of today's Bigfoot or even today's Windigo. The early literature talks about this thing being either a physical flesh and blood being, if it wants, or a spiritual being that could infect your dreams and possess you and take you over and slowly turn you into a Windigo. But in its flesh and blood form, it was always very thin, skeletal. And it could be as big as it wanted, 8 feet, 30 feet. And it always moved in a straight line because it was this elemental force of winter. It didn't need to abide by anything because nothing harmed it. And sometimes it was missing its own mouth and lips because in its insatiable hunt for human flesh, it would consume its own body if there was nothing around. So the difficult thing about the Windigo is, what was it? Was it a flesh and blood creature that you could kill, which many legends of people killing a Windigo? Or was it this spiritual creature that could only be fought by shamans in the spirit world? Or was it both? My colleague Kevin Nelson equates it to much like a caterpillar, the metamorphosis into a butterfly, that they're the same creature, the same species, if you will, or but just they morph into different things. And maybe that's what the Windigo is as well. And it's the most puzzling legend I've ever encountered. After studying it for nearly 20 years and doing this book on it, I feel like I'll never quit learning more about the Windigo, that there's always more out there and that I just barely have a piece of it.
Yeah, pop culture has done it more of a misservice, I think, than your average interpretation of a Bigfoot or a werewolf in pop culture. Because when I think I first, this sounds ridiculous, but I think I first became aware of the Wendigo when there was a Hulk comic where there was the creature Sasquatch from Canada who was like a good guy, and the Wendigo was this other bigger white furred creature in the Hulk all fought. That's when I first heard about the Wendigo, which is obviously nothing at all like the legend. And then movies which are wonderful and terrifying, like Ravenous, for example, which talks about the Wendigo myth, but it doesn't, it turns it more into a vampiric thing than something, so it's never, I don't think popular culture has ever captured the depth and the weirdness of what's in your book, for example.
Many of your listeners, if they Google Windigo, most likely they'll find some depiction of it with antlers, which is a modern interpretation of the Windigo. And just getting back to how, again, I mentioned how these legends change and morph over the years. The same thing happened with the Windigo, where now not only are most of the depictions of it having these giant antlers, but many witnesses who believe they've seen it in modern times, that's the attribute or the physical description they give of it as well, of having these antlers. And sometimes pop culture does play into these stories. For instance, a gentleman contacted me and said he was out in the woods with his buddy hunting. And all of a sudden they split up, and all of a sudden he heard his buddy in the distance kind of yelling out for him. And he thought, that's really weird. And he could see something kind of big moving in the distance in the darkness, but it was getting dark. He was going to head back to their camp, and he didn't want to investigate it, even though he swore it was his buddy talking to him. And when he got back to camp, he said, "Why were you yelling for me?" And his friend said, "Obviously I wasn't. I was miles away. Don't know what you were talking about." So in the guy's mind, he thought back to an episode again of Supernatural, the TV show, and they did a Wendigo-esque episode where the Wendigo was able to mimic people's voices and trick people, luring them, mimicking their friends and family. And he said, "Oh, the Wendigo's able to do that. I must have seen or encountered the Windigo," not knowing that it was a modern pop culture invention, that there's no stories of the Windigo mimicking voices in the old literature, because the Wendigo's voice was enough to paralyze you. If you heard the Windigo speaking, you would freeze in fear, and it could just come and grab you because you're not mobile any longer.
My goodness, that's fascinating how a legend can subsume a popular cultural aspect through some kind of, who knows, subjective interpretation. And while we're talking about pop culture and films and the like, I watched Creature from Big Muddy just last night. I haven't read your, is it Big Muddy Monster? Is that the title of your book? I have it in my Kindle. Yeah. I haven't read it yet though. But that was a story I thought I knew a little bit about as well, but I hardly knew anything about it. Even after watching the documentary, I realized that. But that's often, as you're probably aware, there's an ongoing discussion in Bigfoot lore about whether it's natural or whether it's paranormal or something stranger. But the idea of this massive white furred creature that appears throughout the decades in southern Illinois, there seems to me at least to be something perhaps more paranormal about that than a physical Sasquatch, perhaps.
There are many supernatural aspects to the Big Muddy Monster, what you might want to call high strangeness. John Keel calling it that. Other things that just don't make sense, that if you come at it with a flesh and blood perspective, that this thing's just an undiscovered species and you could capture it or kill it, much like a bear or cougar, whatever else, that some things just don't add up. Some witnesses report that it had glowing red eyes to it, not light shine or reflection, but emanating from the creature itself. And it produces a terror about it as well. Not as though you're hiking in Glacier National Park and you see a bear ahead of you and you're terrified and you start walking back. That's one thing, but witnesses describe it as something they've never felt, that they're overcome with this sense of fear, as though they had walked into a zone of fear and just got the impression that this thing was there to harm them, even though it didn't make any aggressive moves or it gave them no reason to think it was deadly or dangerous. They got the feeling that if I don't get out of here, I'm going to die.
Yeah, there can be some psychological reaction, I think, to the paranormal. We were just talking about that before in the intro, Jen. You were talking about you have this physiological reaction sometimes, including at the place you work at the moment.
Oh, well, yeah, because it's made out of limestone and quartz, the whole building. There's like 3 quarries, and I think there's it's built on top of a cave and everything. So a couple people can feel the energy loss being there, or, you know, sometimes they wonder if there's like any residual energy as well. So I didn't know. Actually, it's kind of a good question to ask you if you've ever had any opinion on the what is it called? The stone tape theory.
Mm-hmm. Well, I try to approach the paranormal or the supernatural right down the middle, saying that what is too weird when you're dealing with the weird? That I try not to rule out any possible explanation just because it sounds weird. And the idea that, you know, certain places are able to record energy or even record events that have happened. And when you walk by, if you're on the right frequency, if you will, it's replayed like a movie, or you pick up on it. Certain people can do that. I love researching that area. It's not really my area of expertise, but I don't discount it. Much like the argument of flesh and blood versus something other, you know, I don't try to come at it at one angle or the other, because I think when you get entrenched into those categories, you lose out on so many other cases. Yeah. And I think there is a limit, though. For instance, I was at a conference once, and after the program, a gentleman came up to me and several colleagues and said, you have to come out to my land. I have several Bigfoot creatures living out there. Mm-hmm. And it was about 9:30 p.m. We thought, great, we'll come out there right now. Let's see it. And as we were gathering up our gear from the conference, he said, oh, but I should warn you, you probably won't see it. Only I can see them because they're in another dimension. Okay. So again, your interest level dips a bit, but I thought, great, still, we'll come. And then he said, oh, but they're probably just boring to you because they do the same things we do. They have pool parties and barbecues and they're doing. So at that point, you know, you kind of lose interest. But again, if you were to cut off every story as being too weird, where do you draw that line? Do you draw it at werewolves? Do you draw chupacabra? Do you spirits haunting, you know, limestone or quartz? Yeah. Where do you draw that line? So for me, I'm always interested. And I forget the lady's name who just did a wonderful book on the theory. And she obviously, in her opinion, debunked it as saying it's not anything that you should be looking at. But I think far too many times people in this field, when books come out that are more like kind of a thought progress or an experiment, they really shun that. Where I think that's how in mainstream science things work. You put out a theory, a proposal, you test it. If it doesn't work, you move on. But in the paranormal, when someone comes out saying that they think modern alien abductions are the same as old fairy people being abducted, people go crazy, and you can't do that. But there are no, for me at least, in my own opinion, there are no hard answers in this field. So that's true. I guess, yeah, that's a long answer to your question.
I think that's the healthy Fordian approach, though. I think when we go back to the books of Charles Fort, he plays around, and you can tell half the time he has his tongue planted deeply in his cheek, but he plays around with all kinds of different theories. And I think one of the problems in the modern broader Fordian field, the broader paranormal and UFO and cryptid field, is people become as entrenched in their ideologies as science often is within a paradigm. So you're right. They don't want to, if they think it's flesh and blood, they don't want to consider something else. If they think they're aliens from Zeta Reticuli, they don't want to think that it's something else. And it's the same vice versa. You're right. If somebody like myself is more likely to think there's a more esoteric explanation or a more unified explanation, it is difficult to segue sometimes into, oh yeah, there's man apes, roaming my backwoods here, so it is a problem that's across lots of theories within the broader Fortean world, I think.
I agree completely. And for me, it's always, I love reading these books and theories. I may not agree with them, but I think they're fascinating and that should be looked into. But I think you're right that not only do people get entrenched into their fields, but also they're unwilling to look at other fields. A lot of UFO people, they do not want to touch other cryptids that are seen in or around UFOs, that UFOs are serious matter to be investigated. These animals, well, that's just foolishness. So you tend to get that when people specialize on a certain field of the paranormal, whether it's ghosts, UFOs, cryptids, crop circles, whatever it may be. So those of us who like the entire spectrum, I think we look at it more of an eye of trying to piece together. And as we mentioned, Zelia Edgar earlier, she's wonderful at doing this, of looking at the big picture. How do these pieces fit together? Where I think if you're in too deep, sometimes you miss that.
Oh, absolutely. And as we start to wind down, how, Chad, if people want to get a hold of your books or get a sense of some of your videos and documentaries and many things you've done, I mean, you've been doing this for almost 30 years. What's the best way for them to check out your materials if they're already not aware and how to do it?
The best way is just my website, Chad Lewis Research. Otherwise, think of the best legend you can, drive out there, and you'll probably find me there.
I love that about your writings too, that you encourage people to go and check it for themselves.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want people to take my word for it one way or the other, to believe or disbelieve. I want them to take their own word for it, get out there, travel to these places, and make up their own minds.
By the way, just before we say goodbye, what was the first book that I ever bought you, Jen, on our first date?
Oh, yes, I actually have it, just in case you were going to ask that question.
Oh, I didn't even, and which wasn't staged either. So
no, I was looking through it. I do actually have one question, because you know me, I like to ask about experience.
But anyway, you should say for the audio people who aren't watching the video, what was the book?
Oh, the Iowa Road Guide to Haunted Locations.
There you go.
So yeah, but I just one more question, because I'm curious to know if you've experienced any of your own paranormal phenomena.
Interesting question. And I'm going to use that, your first date, on the back of the book. It should write, "This book brings couples together."
Yeah.
But for me, experiencing things is always very tricky, because 99% of the time I go to these places, nothing happens. And obviously, when you're only there for a night or two, you can't expect things to just pop up on demand. It just doesn't seem to work like that, at least in my experience. But the little things that do happen, they're always very subtle and just enough to make you realize, did this really happen, or was it some other explanation? Just or was it supernatural? For instance, I was walking in a alleged haunted cemetery with some people, and I had some piece of equipment in my hand, just walking. We're spread out. It's dark. When all of a sudden my hand hits somebody, and I turn around and say, "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was a colleague of mine." Something stopped my hand from moving, but nobody was there. My colleagues were spread out. So it left me with, what could explain that? Was it paranormal, supernatural, or something more mundane? I don't know, but it's always for me like that, really subtle things. It's unfortunately never anybody speaking in tongues, or things flying across the room, or, a chupacabra descending from an aircraft. Nothing cool like that. It's always odd voices you catch on your audio recorder that weren't audible to the naked ear.
And before we let you go, can you give us a hint of your next book, which we'll be eagerly awaiting?
Yeah, I'm doing a little. My interest right now in the paranormal is on the edges of the paranormal. So my next book is looking at lumberjack creatures of the Northwoods, which are all fictional. They were only, as far as we know, made up in the minds of the lumberjacks. Things like the hodag, which you're probably familiar with.
Do you have the hide behind in there?
The hide behind, the hoop snake, the hoogag, all these creatures that, we've forgotten so much of the lumber industry, where tens of thousands of men in the Midwest in the late 1800s, early 1900s would go up for the whole winter and live in a bunkhouse with other lumberjacks. And at night, the only thing they had to do was to spin yarns and tell tales of these creatures that were lurking in these never-ending woods. So I'm fascinated by stories like that. Now, is it paranormal? Probably not, but it's on the edge of paranormal, because these creatures, many thought they existed. Some still say they do, in terms of the hodag and others. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in old hobo legends and how they pertain to the supernatural, or carnival and circus performers, their superstitions and their legends. They don't fit right down the main alley of the paranormal or supernatural, but I think they would probably be considered more folklore that is adjacent to it.
Let's get you back for that book, because that would be a blast. And just when we talk briefly about the hide behind, then I've always wondered if there wasn't some truth to that, a la missing 411, like there was something there that could disappear and then grab people. Who knows? Maybe we can talk about that next time anyway.
Yes, hopefully it doesn't get us before then.
Right.
Hopefully. You keep it weird, Chad, anyway. Thank you so much.
Keep an eye out.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe.